just going through the cross-cultural studies of attachment study, meta-analysis by Van Isendorn and Kroonenberg. I didn't feel like I covered it in enough detail in the last lesson, which was lesson 10, so I just want to go through it in a little bit more detail. So if there are any more things that you need to take down from this, please do. So first of all, it's a meta-analysis of numerous strange situations. They say experiments, but controlled observations conducted in different countries. And just to be clear, a meta-analysis is where a researcher looks at findings from a number of different studies in order to reach a general conclusion. So they don't actually carry out a single study themselves, they just get a lot of pieces of research that have already been conducted and collate the evidence together. So first of all, the aims of their research were to investigate the reported rates of different infant attachment types in a range of cultures. But they wanted to look at what's interesting here is the differences within the cultures and between the cultures. And when most books report on Van Isendorn and Kroonenberg, they tend to only look at the differences between cultures. But just think about that within them. Sorry, I know I keep saying cultures, but remember that within a country there are lots of different cultures, and therefore there are going to be differences within that country. So the procedure, if you're asked to outline, you won't be asked to outline a procedure, but you could be asked to say what somebody did and what they found. So they carried out a meta-analysis of 32 studies, and they were conducted in 8 countries. And I just want to say, I did show you a little bit of that yesterday. 18 of the studies were carried out in the USA, so we have got a bias there, and that's probably the best way that we could evaluate this. First of all, the other things that you need to know, they only observed mother and infant pairs. There were no fathers observed, and there were no other caregivers. And all of the infants were classified into the 3 attachment types, A, B, and C, which is obviously secure, insecure, avoidant, and insecure, resistant. They excluded any studies that involved any children who had any kind of special needs and any children who were older than 2 years. Think about why they might do this. Again, it is an aim of it's a way of controlling. So when we talk about what controls were put in place to make a study standardised, there are 2 controls that were put in place. And whilst you don't really need that for this study, you could argue that a strength of this piece of research is that Van Isendorn and Kroonenberg did try to control it as well as possible, therefore increasing the scientific nature of the research. Again, if you're designing your own research, you might want to think about ways in which you can control. So there are some restrictions that are put in place just to control the study. And there are the findings. And if we just start off, first of all, we've got the countries that were used. And remember, I've said to you that I would like you to use Germany, obviously West Germany as it was at the time, Israel, Japan and USA. But it's totally up to you if you want to use others. It's just they're the main ones that are quoted. And again, if you have a look at the first column, you can see there's the first problem with the research because we've got a bias, because we don't have the same number of studies from each country, and therefore already we could argue that we've got problems with validity, with drawing conclusions, because we're not comparing like with like. If you look at the number of infant mother pairs, again, China, which is why really the data from China is, whether it's useful or not is a matter for discussion, because they only use 25. But again, we've got a different number of mother-infant pairs. And why is that significant? Because again, we're not comparing like with like. When we look at the USA, it's clearly very biased towards a Western culture. And then again, at the side, you've got the percentages of the insecure avoidant, insecure resistant, and secure attachment. And really, you just need to have the broad figures of those, so we know generally that secure is attachment overall. And in a Western culture like Germany, USA, Britain, insecure avoidant is higher, insecure resistant is largely rare, non-existent. Whereas in countries like Japan and Israel, insecure resistant is higher and insecure avoidant is generally not seen. You don't necessarily, the purpose of the task underneath really is, and I would get you to do this in class just to see where they are in the world, so that what you can see is that clearly there are different, it's certain parts of the world that have certain child rearing practices. So what were the findings first of all? And these findings I think are a little bit different to the ones I showed you yesterday. So the differences within a culture. So that's, for example, if we just take the USA within a culture. So there was a 1.5 times greater variation within a culture than between a culture. So for example, one of the German samples was as different from another German sample as it was from an Israeli kibbutzism or from a US sample. So in other words, there is lots of variation in Germany in the way that parents bring up their children and the way that parents care for and form attachments with the children. One of the Japanese samples was more similar to two of the US samples than to the other Japanese sample. Again, showing massive variation and differences within a culture. And the Israeli city sample was more like the USA than it was the Israeli kibbutzism sample. Just to make it clear what a kibbutz is, a kibbutz is usually not something that you would see in certainly one of the big cities. It's where a child is brought up with probably up to 5 mothers or caregivers, and they're breastfed by several, and they don't have one particular mum. They kind of pool care. So that's very different from our culture. But what's interesting is that in Israel you have people who bring up their children just like in the USA, but then some who are brought up in kibbutz. So we have to think about the massive variations between the two. But these are the main conclusions. Secure attachment still seems to be the norm on a wide range of cultures. The research does seem to support the idea that attachment is innate and universal, but obviously remember there is variation within and between cultures. The research also shows that cultural practices do have an influence on the attachment style. Have a look through the material that you've got on the shared area or in the files on Teams, and have a look at some other cross-cultural studies. Have a look at what the studies are. You don't really need any apart from this. It's not going to make you get higher marks by quoting more research. It's what you do with the studies that are important. So what you will need to do, and I know that somebody's already sent me this question, but outline and evaluate research into cultural variations. The 12 there is for anybody who was doing AS, but that won't apply to you. 16 marks. I would expect you to use Van Isendorn and Cronenberg, and the other study that I've mentioned is Takahashi, which is the Japanese one, which was actually included in Van Isendorn and Cronenberg's study. Okay, so if there's anything else that I can help you with this, please get back to me. And this is just a further lesson, just consolidating really on the study into cross-cultural differences. Thank you.